Hey guys, it's Bella, and welcome back to our Learn Gothic group lessons in Guthic Discord. And our little historical tidbit for us to think about this week is the matter of Romanitas and like Romanness, right? And how it relates to the Gothic speaking peoples who settled in Ostrogothic Italy and Visigothic Spain. There were, of course, Gothic communities in Moesia and like the Crimea and various things, but um, as these areas are Greek speaking, I have less access to the historical sources about them, the historical sources, so I can't teach you guys as much about them. And also, these lessons thus far have been a little bit biased towards the Ostrogothic kingdom because I have a greater interest in the Ostrogoths. But next week we're going to look at Visigothic art, so that's going to be quite fun. What we have here is a likely mosaic of King Theodoric, who was like a very sort of he was the first king of the Ostrogoths in Italy and a very popular ruler. And allegedly, according to this chronicle, the Anonymous Valesianus Chronicle, it says, Dum in literatus esse tantes sapientiae fuit, ut aliqua quae locutus est, in vulgo usque nunc prosententia beantur. So, although he was illiterate, he was so wise that several things which he said are held in the common tongue to this very day as a proverb. So we have, and the author gives two examples. So we have two sayings of King Theodoric, which apparently became Visigothic proverbs, and one of them, most interestingly, is this one here, which we have translated into Gothic for you. So, Theoderix Theodans quath, Rumans venachs gutin Galikov, jach brux gutar Rumana Galikov, which means a miserable Roman imitates a Goth, and a useful Goth imitates a Roman. So we can see some very interesting, I guess, almost internalized racism is maybe too strong a term, but xenophobia, an internalized hatred of Gothicness and Gothic culture. Certainly, it's Theodoric is framing it as inferior to Roman culture. And here we have the epilogue, the finishing clause of the Edictum Theodergy, which is a set of laws, of Roman laws, which King Theodoric promulgated. And in these laws, he does seem to make a distinction between Romans who are going to be governed by their traditional Roman laws and barbarians. He doesn't refer to them as Goths, but he refers to them as barbarians who are going to be governed by their military laws in the camp. And he says that, however much our duties could allow or could occur to us in the present, we embrace these things to come, these things being the laws that he's just laid out, for all Romans and barbarians, which the devotion of all barbarians and Romans should preserve. So the point of his edict is that he's not quite doing a separate but equal. What he's saying is that Romans and barbarians are different kinds of people, and they have different roles and responsibilities to the Roman state, but they should cooperate in making Theodoric's government great, I suppose, is one way you could put it. And in Ostrogothic Italy, Spain, in Visigothic Spain, Roman culture, which is called Romanitas in Latin, or Romanness, it was the prestige, aspirational culture, and the Ostrogothic kings and the Visigothic ones usually combined Romanness with barbarianness or Barbaritas in their iconography. And here we have a medallion of King Theodoric, which is modelled on a coin, and it's actually quite common for it's not only quite common for migration era people to make jewelry out of coins or to make jewelry that's meant to look like coins, but even in certain quote unquote third world countries to this very day, or economically underdeveloped countries in the present day, coins feature quite prominently in jewelry as a sort of, almost like a cargo cult sort of symbol. So the inscription here reads Rex Theodoricus, and then the next, so it's King Theodoric, and the next two words are quite interesting. It reads Pius Princip, and then Pius Princius. So pious, and then it's a shortened for prince. Now Princius, it could be a sort of vulgar Latin way of saying prince, but it's interesting that he calls himself a prince and not a king, given that he was meant to be ruling on behalf of the Byzantine Emperor Zeno. And in this coin, we can see a rather interesting fusion of symbolism. So, King Theodoric's hair is a bit unruly for a Roman. A Roman would have maybe had their hair a bit shorter and more kempt. You can see on his lip he's got the Germanic moustache, which the early medieval English, the Lombards, all the rest of these people, they're quite well famous for sporting this moustache, whereas the Romans would of course be clean shaven. Um, he's holding his right hand up, this little cute little chibi-like hand that he's got in the key row gesture signifying peace. But his dress actually is quite Roman. He's basically wearing the larica squamata, which is a modern term, by the way, of Roman military generals. Not He's not wearing togas, but he's also not wearing civilian clothing. He's definitely framing himself as a barbarian military ruler who is nonetheless incorporating several aspects of Romanitas, such as imperial coinage, having his name put in Latin on a coin, but then also he's holding the imperial Roman scepter in his left hand with a symbol of Rome, a Roman personification held upright in his hand. So we can see in this medallion a real fusion of barbarianness and Romanness in one object. And it's worth looking at some of the things which did actually change with the arrival of the Ostrogoths in Italy. So these are Germanic fibulae, which are sort of brooches, they're pins, and you can see that they almost look like safety pins, they're like very fancy safety pins. And there's a little needle that goes through the bottom of them, and they would be used to fasten your cloak in place as you were walking about. And they're very pretty, adorned with all sorts of lovely jewels and whatnot. I believe the technique is referred to as cloisonné jewelry, and this kind of brooch, the quote-unquote radiate head brooch, although it has precedence in late antique Roman dress fashions in the West, it seems that the immigrating Germanic peoples had quite a liking for this, and so it became much more popular in the centuries of the migration era. And this is sort of a general trend that we see in art and architecture and archaeology from these times, is that artifacts and art styles which existed among the Roman population prior to the arrival of Germanic speaking peoples, they didn't drop out. Like, the impact of the Germanic peoples isn't that they completely replaced the culture of the Romans, it's that they resulted in elements of Roman culture which the German people seem to have preferred being more popular. So it's almost like most of what's on the table is Roman, and the Germans are just like, or the Germanic peoples rather, are just taking or producing more of the Roman stuff that happens to take their fancy. Here, of course, we have the Codex Argenteos, and it really shows the imbrication of Ostrogothic culture within Byzantine and within Roman sensibilities. So Emperor Theodoric would have had to apply to permission actually to Constantinople, to the Byzantine emperor, to be allowed to use the purple in this way, because it's such an expensive material. And you can see here that the ink itself is actually silver, and it's got gold for certain important points, and it's actually got these Eusebian canons at the bottom, which tell where the Gospels agree or disagree with each other. So we can see here how even in the Gothic language of the Arian Church, they are very much mapping themselves onto Roman ways of representation. Here also we can see it in a letter by a Visigothic king, actually King Sigebut. And a fun side fact about King Sigebut is we actually have a legend written by King Sigebut which amazingly survives to the present day. And if people would like me to do a short video on it, or maybe incorporate it into another Gothic lesson, just ask me and I'm very happy to. It's a very exciting story, one of my favorite genres in medieval literature. We could even try to translate it into Gothic if people would like. It's written in Latin, but both that legend and this letter are written in a very florid, a very highly educated style of Latin, showing that the Gothic kings were apparently imitating elaborate Latin of the Romans whose regions they were occupying. And one can actually make an argument in the case of King Sisebert's letter here that it betrays a sort of insecurity, that he's overcompensating in being extra fancy with his Latin because his Latin maybe isn't that good, so he's maybe finding some of these words in dictionaries. This is a kind of argument that requires a sustained analysis of the surviving text attributed to King Sisebut, and so, for instance, we could see which proportion of the words that he uses are commonly found in glossaries or dictionaries, which would indicate that they're not words commonly used in vulgar Latin, and therefore he's deliberately looking them up in order to sound fancy. And this would be a characteristic that's common in insular Latin, where monks and such lot who are learning Latin as a literary, scholarly language are writing Latin like this, using a lot of words in dictionaries in this very fancy style that becomes quite unintelligible. And it's the reason they do that is because they're not actually speaking Latin in their day-to-day lives, but they're speaking Irish, they're speaking Old English, they're speaking Welsh, these kinds of things. So if such analysis of King Sisebut's letter and other such texts attributed to him were to be sustained, if we were to do an analysis of these things, we could demonstrate that King Sisebut likely was a predominantly Gothic-speaking king rather than a predominantly Latin-speaking king. But that's a difficult argument to substantiate, and the research hasn't been done on that. So I'm going to move on. And we're going to look at these lovely mosaics from Il Domo dei Tappeti di Pietra in 5th or 6th century Ravenna. And the reason I bring these up, what's so interesting about them, is that they could be Ostrogothic or they could be Byzantine. We have no real way of distinguishing them. In this gentleman, unfortunately, his face, his jaw has been sort of cut off, so we don't know if he had a moustache. And it's actually worth popping back to look at this one of King Theodoric with the moustache, because we have to remember that so much of the culture of the Ostrogoths that we have surviving, in fact, the only Ostrogoths who call themselves Goths seem to be the royal family, and most of the surviving representation of Goths we have made by Goths themselves comes from people like King Theodoric, who were in the royal family and were representing themselves. So if we take this symbol of the moustache as an example, it may be misleading to read the moustache back onto the Ostrogoths in general as like this is a way that Ostrogoths in general dressed, when it might have just been how the royal family dressed, in the same way that I'm trying to find, like, most British people, I can assure you, do not walk around holding corgis in their hands like the Queen. Maybe some would like to, but we don't do that because we're normal. And a little side note, in this image we can see, so it's called Il Buon Pastore in Italian, the Good Shepherd, and we can actually see he's got this little pan flute that he is strung up, which has 7 little holes in it, so 7 notes. And it does seem that Cassiodorus, who was essentially the prime minister of the Ostrogothic government, he wrote a treatise on music where he says that there are 7 tones to music. So I think it's quite likely that these 7 notes are those 7 tones of the Greek modes which Cassiodorus references in his treatise on music. So we can have a link here between the documentary evidence and the texts from the Ostrogothic kingdom and their representations of music and art. And to some extent, perhaps this man's dress might have been quite common of both the Ostrogoths and the Romans in Italy, although even the distinction culturally between a Roman and a Goth might not have been so distinct in most circumstances. And here we see a figure playing these panpipes, accompanied by a dance of 4, although the 4th one has been cut out, genii, or sort of spirits, as it were, representing different seasons of the year. So if I understand correctly, we have spring holding the hand of winter, who is in white, and opposite winter is summer, and then we would have autumn on the other side. Or of course the order could be reversed, it's not quite clear. The orange one might well be autumn. So we have a sense of how it might be used. I also very briefly want to point out that we have these circles, we have the little squares on these people's tunics. This man has rings and circles on his tunics. Reenactors tend to sort of recreate clothes that are plain colours and dull colours, and this wasn't the case. Like, medieval people dressed very lively. His shoes here also, actually, these kind of bindings, to my knowledge, these kinds of leg wrappings weren't that common in late antiquity, so this might be a fashion that is made more popular by the incoming Goths, but we can't know for sure. And I guess the last point is that the turquoise color in these mosaics is very expensive, so I imagine that this is meant to be representing maybe a more well-off farmer, but I wouldn't stake my money on that, but although if I remember correctly, the blue color is quite expensive, and in medieval manuscripts certainly it's used almost exclusively in depictions of the Virgin Mary because of how expensive it is. And here is the last point to sort of round everything off. This is part of, these are from the mosaics in San Apollinare di Nuovo church in Ravenna, and this seems to have been the church of the Arian Ostrogothic kings in Ravenna. And after Emperor Justinian reconquered Italy and reconverted it to Catholicism, the depictions in the mosaics in San Apollinare di Nuovo were censored as the Arian clergy was removed and Catholic clergy took over this church. And the fact that they were able to do this tells us quite a lot. The fact that they were literally just able to make a change of staff and keep using the church more or less as normal suggests that the Gothic churches and the Gothic Arian churches and the Latin-speaking Catholic churches probably weren't very different in terms of how they functioned, how they looked, and this depiction of the palace seems, for the most part, just like a late antique Roman palace. But what's quite interesting about this is you'll notice you have these colonnades and you've got these curtains, but what's very curious is that we don't really, in late antique art of this sort, you would normally have people here, but you don't actually. Here what we have are the people have been removed. This is presumably Palatium. It was once King Theodoric's palace, but it's since been censored. And actually, if you look on the white of the pillars, here and there, we have hands which used to belong to the courtesans of King Theodoric, which were holding onto the pillars and which were censored by the conquering Byzantines in order to remove the memory of King Theodoric's government from Ravenna. So we have a very interesting case of the need to remove these images of Gothic politicians while still leaving the aesthetic of the palace intact, because the aesthetic of the palace matches a Roman aesthetic and therefore it's intelligible to the conquering Byzantines. So my point in this, I suppose, is to drive home the point that Romanness and barbarianness, because the barbarian Goths were imitating the Romans, it seems, to their greatest extent in most cases, aesthetically they might have looked quite similar. So, and that's why this figure here, if we go back, we do not know if he is Roman or if he is Gothic or Roman or Byzantine. We can't know for sure. So that has been our little history tidbit. Does anyone have any questions?